Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome as our presenters today Jeanne McCarten and Mike McCarthy. Jeanne and Mike are two of the authors of Viewpoint, a two-level series for adults and young adults, taking learners from a high intermediate to advanced level of proficiency, the CEFR levels B2 to C1. Mike is Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Nottingham in the UK, and the author of titles such as English Vocabulary and Use and Spoken Language and Applied Linguistics, and also helped develop the Cambridge Spoken Corpora. Jeanne taught English in Sweden, France, Malaysia and the UK before becoming an ELT writer, and has particular focus on applying insights from corpus research to language teaching. So, Jeanne will be starting. Over to you, Jeanne.
Thank you, Alistair, and good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see so many of you from all different parts of the world. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar.
And hello from Mike McCarthy. It's great to have you all here. Just to let you know that Jeanne and I will be alternating our commentary, and Jeanne's going to start.
Okay, so about a month ago, Helen Sandiford and I did a webinar on blended learning, particularly at the lower levels. And today we're going to focus on the problems and prospects of blended learning at the higher levels, some of which are shared and some of which are different. Let's start off by just explaining what we mean by blended learning. Blended learning is really using a combination of print and online materials in class and in an online self-study environment. So print materials, books and CDs are used in class, and the online environment gives students lots of material that they can use for self-study. We'll be talking today mostly about what we call fully blended materials. And by that we mean materials which deliver the same content and learning outcomes in print and online. So in other words, the online material also teaches the content of the material. The material becomes both the content and the teacher, if you like, and there are presentations of language of different kinds, as well as practice opportunities. Another phrase that you hear, another term that you hear in connection with blended learning is that of the flipped classroom. And by that we mean a classroom where practice of learning takes place. So traditionally in a classroom, the teacher teaches the content and students go home and practice it in homework. With the flipped classroom model, what happens is that students do the learning outside of the classroom through the material that they have online, and what happens inside the classroom is the practice element, if you like, and also troubleshooting and further explanation. But that's what we mean by the flipped classroom. It turns the teaching and practice phases on their heads. Now, technology is a wonderful thing, and we tend to think of it as something that will help solve all of our problems. But I think we need to be cautious, and Lewis 2009 sums up our philosophy that technology isn't everything. It isn't the solution to everything. Technology is nothing without a teacher and a plan. So basically what he's saying is that technology alone is not going to teach your students. Behind every blended course is a teacher who knows what he or she wants their students to achieve and how to achieve it. There are different ways of using online time. One is as preparation for class, so you can ask your students to do all the grammar and vocabulary, for example, that they need to learn in order to do some class activity that you have planned. Or you can ask them to practice some conversation strategies that they're going to need in class at a later date. So you can use it as a preparation or as a rehearsal, if you like, for class. You can also use students' online time as consolidation of class teaching, and this is the model that's used very often when you use an online workbook, but with fully blended materials, with presentations of language as well. You can ask students to review and go over the language that you've taught, and you can ask them to repeat activities online to help consolidate what you have taught them in class. Online time can also be an alternative to class. Many teachers prefer not to use their class time for reading activities or developing reading skills. They think it's something that students can do at home. So in that model you can ask students to do all the reading activities online, or perhaps all the writing activities online. You can decide what you want students to do as an alternative to your doing it with them in class. And I think finally, online time can be used for new types of learning, learning opportunities that the online environment gives you that you can't have in class. And we'll be looking at some examples later on, but one simple example of this is that when students are learning online, they have the facility to record their voice, for example, and compare it with a model. So there are new activity types and new types of learning that students can do online. How you decide to divide your time is very much up to you, and how what you ask students to do online as opposed to in class, again, is your decision. From our own experience and research that we are familiar with in a major international university group, the teachers there made a decision pretty much unanimously when they were deciding on the blend. And in considering the question, how would I like to make best use of time in class, all the teachers came to the same conclusion: getting my students to use the language communicatively. And this is from research done by Johnson and Marsh, which is in press, and we will put up the title of this publication later on. So teachers seem to be coming to the conclusion that class time is best used for communicative use of language. I'm going to hand over to Mike now.
Well, we can see, therefore, some of the challenges in a fully blended online course that Jeanne's already outlined. That is that the materials have to become the teacher. There's not that separation, that nice separation that there is in the face-to-face classroom, where the teacher can react moment by moment to the way the students are handling the material. In the complete online course, the materials have to do everything. So we're going to look at two examples, one of which is perhaps more straightforward than the other. We're going to look at the example of grammar teaching online and the question of expanding the learner's grammatical repertoire. So we're not talking about beginners or elementary level here today. We're talking about learners who probably already know quite a lot of grammar, and we want to expand that repertoire, that knowledge. Our second example is perhaps even more challenging, and that is, how does one deal with the notion of conversation in a fully blended program in the online environment? It's quite different, obviously, from the face-to-face classroom where people can talk in real time with either with the teacher or with one another. Here we have something that is a greater challenge, but we hope to show you some solutions that we've been able to advance on this front. Okay, so let's start with grammar, and I just want to look at one area for taking your students to higher level, to the more advanced levels. There are many different things you can do, but the one thing that I want to look at now, that we're going to consider, is how do you expand the knowledge of functions or meanings for the grammar that your learners already know. So it's not just a question of constantly learning new grammatical forms. We want to look now at how you can expand and establish new meanings, new functions for the forms, the grammar that your learners already know. So let's start by looking at what happens in the typical face-to-face live classroom when we teach grammar. Well, in the methodology that Jeanne and I have always adopted in our work with our co-author Helen Sandiford, we begin with some sort of introduction. This is probably something that you all do. You need to warm up the topic. You need to offer scaffolding, and scaffolding is quite a complex affair in the face-to-face classroom. It's teachers exploiting the learning potential of their students and giving them the support that they need moment by moment in order to make learning more efficient. Usually there's some kind of topic warm-up as well, and usually some kind of vocabulary preview, so that when the learners are practicing or being exposed to the grammar, there aren't too many distractions from difficult vocabulary. So I'm sure we would all agree that these are key elements of the face-to-face classroom, and the challenge is putting this sort of thing online. Grammar nowadays usually involves the exploitation of some sort of text. It may be that in parts of the world students still just work with sentences, but generally within the communicative language teaching environment, we exploit some kind of text. It could be a dialogue, a conversation, it could be an article from a newspaper or an article from a website. And then typically that exploitation will involve some kind of comprehension check, perhaps a reaction to that text. You know, what do you think about it? What do you think the author is getting at? Or who do you think these people are, etc., etc. And some kind of discussion. So this is a typical sort of warm-up phase of grammar teaching. So just starting with those two elements, how do we achieve these practices in the online environment? Well, all we can do is show you examples that we have used ourselves in our materials, and you will be the judge as to whether you think they do the job that we say is necessary. So activating the topic and personalizing, well, this is not too difficult online. In this case, we have an example of the topic of keeping in touch. And we try to do two things here. That is to actually activate that topic with the sorts of things that people do nowadays to keep in touch. They talk on their cell phones, their mobile phones, they text each other, they use social networks, emails, etc. But crucially, we also include here something that makes it personal, that enables the learner personally to choose the answers for him or herself. So you would select one of these squares and click on it, and so forth. Vocabulary preview, we can do that online as well. So in this case, learners can drag and drop the vocabulary which is in the boxes and relate the key vocabulary that we want to exploit in the grammar to definitions such as things you do not often or sometimes, things you do often, and things you do always. And there are the key adverbs: regularly, all the time, once in a while, constantly, mostly, occasionally. These are going to be the key lexical props for the grammar. So it's obviously a good idea to activate this before we throw the students in at the deep end, because don't forget, they're not in the classroom. They can't put their hand up and say, sorry teacher, what does occasionally mean? So as we've said and keep on saying, the material actually becomes the tutor. There's not a teacher standing there in the background, always ready to help and looking at you and being aware that you're having difficulties because you're frowning or looking puzzled. So we can then move on to that comprehension check. And again, this can be done online with selecting right answers, and the machine will tell you when you've got it right by giving you a little tick, a check mark, or it will tell you when you've got it wrong by making a cross. And you're doing this on the basis of a little video over here which you watch, and the activity on the left is checking your comprehension of what you see and hear in that video. So far so good. This is all fairly straightforward. Then we move on to that next phase, which is where the learners react in a personal way. So we're trying to recreate in this online environment the sorts of things you do in the classroom, but without the teacher looking over your shoulder. This is an example of a true or false activity, but true or false for you, not true or false as facts in the world, so to speak. Crucially for us, this element of personalization, which we feel is so important in the class, has to be highlighted online, and we do this with, in this case, with this little box that actually says make the sentences true for you, add more examples, and say them out loud, because we believe that the best kind of learning takes place when you can personalize something. And of course, when you're in the online environment, that personalization to a great extent has to be your responsibility. You have to think about your own life, your own preferences, your own environment. But we do feel that perhaps we need to remind learners that this is an important phase. It's not something that just happens because we're trying to fill up the time. Now, if we go back at this point to the typical face-to-face classroom, we've had our preview of the vocabulary, we've had our exploitation of the text, etc. So what next? What do we typically do next when we're teaching grammar? Well, in our methodology, there is a focus on illustrating the language through interacting with the text. So in other words, we are not concerned with just presenting a sentence and then the rule that shows you how that sentence works. Traditionally, grammar teaching was based on what were called the 3 Ps: presentation, practice, and production. And the teacher presented a particular grammar item, the students practiced it, and then were expected to actually produce it, whether in the classroom or in homework activities. We take a slightly different approach. We'd rather think of the 3 Is, and here are the first 2 of those Is, that we illustrate the language, and that's quite a complex affair. It's not just showing a sentence, it's illustrating how the language actually, how the grammar actually works, what people use it for, who uses it in what kind of situation. That's what we're trying to do with illustration. And interaction, that second phase, is crucially where the learning begins to evolve and unfold. This is where the learners themselves, in the face-to-face classroom, of course, in interaction with one another and with the teacher, where the learners themselves begin to understand what it is they're trying to learn and what the goal is. And this is something, of course, that happens in a very delicate way in face-to-face classrooms. Again, there is scaffolding from the teacher, there is interaction with one's peers, there is feedback from the teacher as we go along, moment by moment. The third of the 3 I's are activities which lead to induction. This is where you, the learner, work out for yourself what the rule is, and you relate it to what you already know about grammar, you relate it to what you have seen and heard about the way people use the grammar. So we have 3 I's, and this third I, induction, involves freer and independent use of the item. After all, if you can use it freely and independently, it probably means you have induced the meaning and function of the particular piece of grammar. Illustration, interaction, and induction are 3 terms that were coined by myself and Ronald Carter in a paper in 1995, where we were discussing the problems of teaching the spoken language. And we realized that, especially with conversational language, you can't just do the same old thing of present, practice, and produce. So let's have a look at how this, again, might work in the online environment. These are quite tricky aspects of grammar teaching. We don't want to just present a sentence and then tell the students the rule. We want to try and follow this principle of the 3 I's. So the issue that I mentioned earlier was expanding the repertoire of functions and meanings for the grammar that you already know. And here is a little text. This could be in a book or it could be online. In fact, it's both in our case. And in this little remark, this comment by Sarah Wang, who's a young woman, 19 years old, we see her talking. Similarly, we have a slightly more mature woman, should I say, Victoria, who's 40. And these are comments which are based on the evidence of our corpora. So just as we believe in the real classroom and in print textbooks that it is important to expose the learners to authentic language taken from corpora, we do the same online. So what do we want the students to do here? Well, we want them to notice that this form will, which they've already learnt as a way of talking about the future, in fact is often used to talk about things you do regularly or things that happen in the present, things that happen repeatedly or occasionally in the present. Every once in a while, I'll instant message a friend, okay? Similarly, Victoria up there also uses will to talk about the present. Occasionally my son will email someone, so they know that will is used to talk about the future. Now they're seeing it illustrated in a typical way in which it's used to refer to present time. But also notice here we have in Victoria's comment, but with friends he tends to text. And tend was one of those verbs that we neglect in grammar teaching. But if you look at a corpus of speaking, whether it be British English or North American English or English used by expert users around the world, you'll soon see that tend is one of the most frequent verbs that people use to talk about things that they do regularly or occasionally or repeatedly or habitually in the present. So this is the target, this is the grammar target. And what can we do with this? Well, As we've said, the next stage is in some way interacting with this text, not just reading it. And what we consider important, if you look down below there where it says number 2, is figuring it out. And the figuring it out is the first step in the process towards induction. So we're not just stating a rule, we're saying read this text, react to it, figure out what it is that enables these two women to talk about their present activities. So here you can find sentences in the interviews with a similar meaning to the ones below. So number 1 there, with friends he usually texts. Number 2, every once in a while I instant message. Well, the young woman actually says every once in a while I will instant message with a friend. So you're reacting to it. Figure it out activities help the learners to notice the important things about grammar. In the classroom, we can just say, look, you're not understanding. This is what we're trying to do today. In the online environment, you haven't got that prop from the mindful teacher. You just have to really explicitly direct the learners towards the kind of interaction that you want. So the answer here to number 2, every once in a while I instant message. You notice that what she actually says is every once in a while I'll instant message. Now I'm going to hand over to Jeanne because we certainly haven't finished there.
Thank you. So Mike has been talking about helping students to figure things out and notice things about a text, but there's something else that I think we need to point out at this point. Learners today have grown up in the digital age, and we call them digital natives. They're so used to working in the digital world. That is, in fact, their world. But one of the comments made by Johnson and Marsh 2013, which I think really rings true for us, is that the confident digital native is not necessarily a confident digital learner. So, okay, they're comfortable working in the online world, they're comfortable with technology, but they're not necessarily confident in using that for learning. And they perhaps don't also see the learning potential or the learning opportunities that there are in the online world. And for that reason, we need to help learners, especially at the advanced levels, to see the point of activities and to see how they can use activities to exploit their potential to the full. So the first activity here, Mike showed earlier on, where we are asking students to say sentences out loud and say things which are true about themselves out loud as part of the learning process. And here with that figure it out activity, here's an explanation as to why students are doing the activity that they're doing. Because if you understand why you are doing something and how something is going to help you learn, then it helps develop you as a learner. And I think there was a question earlier on about the importance of learner reflection and learner training, and this is one aspect of that, helping students to understand why they are doing these activities. Going back to our teaching sequence, Mike talked about explanation, following up this noticing and figuring out phrase, and explanation, clear step-by-step explanation of a grammar structure is something that teachers do quite a lot. And I think the charts that we put into materials, they're all fine, but they do need a teacher to help interpret, navigate and expand them. And the grammar charts in print books are really condensed because the page is quite a small space. You don't have a lot of room to go into detail and to explain things in full very often. But of course online you have lots of room to expand, and you can present the grammar step by step. This is recorded, students listen and read, and each point is taken in turn, whereas in the print material this would be much more put together. I think it's 3 or 4 lines. And so the online material can give extra examples, it can give extra little points, and can help students understand and talk students through the new structure, as well as remind them of things that they already know but perhaps forget, like the third person negative forms and the third person S forms and so on. And just as a good teacher, as they are teaching material, they check as they go along, and they check students are following them and understand the concepts that they're explaining. And in the same way, the online material can do this too. So in the middle of the presentation, students see some of the examples, and then they do a little activity. So number 1, if you say occasionally my son will use email, you are talking about the present or the future. And we hope that after the explanation, students are going to choose the present. So the online material can do a lot of the teaching that you might do in class, and therefore it's no wonder then that teachers feel more confident that they're able to use class time for more communicative activities. And then following explanation, there are no end of ways that grammar can be practiced, and I'm not going to show you all the different ways that we can do that online. I'm sure you're very familiar with the range of activities that students can do online, from simple choosing of correct forms to actually typing in correct forms and so on. But earlier on we talked about how the online environment offers new ways of practicing and learning English, and I'd just like to show you a couple of these which come at the end of a sequence. Once students have done all the very controlled and written practice. Someone asked earlier, can students only write online? Well, no, they don't only have to write online. And here's the introduction to posting on a spoken forum. So what happens here is students hear questions like, how do you normally catch up with your friends by phone? They can also hear sample answers that they haven't come across before, and they can listen to those sample answers, and they can also read the audio of those. And then they record their own answer to that question, and they can record and listen, and they can re-record it. So if you like, they are rehearsing their answer, and that's something that class time really doesn't often give students very often, the chance to rehearse, perfect, get better, and just that acre of time so that students can speak in an extended way. And these are the kinds of questions that might be in the book that you would ask students to discuss in class when they come in class, when they're sitting in groups or with pairs and they're interacting in a normal way. So students rehearse their answers to different questions, and then they go on to a spoken forum, They post their post, their answer, and then the next stage is that they listen to their classmates' responses to the questions that they've been asked, and they reply. So they record comments or ask questions, and they can keep up. It's not a real-time conversation, but it's posting spoken questions and answers, and it's quite a nice way of getting that spoken interaction outside of the class. We talked earlier about grammar, and now we're going to look at how this might work for conversation and how the online environment might help students to develop their conversational skills. Before we do though, I'd just like to spend a few moments thinking about what the principles of good conversation classes and as a result good conversation materials might be, and how it's important to observe some of these principles in online materials. When you come to the conversation class, the material that you're presenting them with as models or as exercise items, practice items, should really be within the student's language abilities. This isn't the place to teach variations of the third conditional or embedded questions and tricky points of grammar. We're aiming towards fluency here. So even though we are often teaching them new language, it should be language which is comfortable for students to learn for the purpose of the conversation. We also believe that the activity types should be familiar in the sense that they're not difficult to negotiate either in class or online, so that they don't interfere with the students' ability to produce and to work towards fluency. When we shouldn't be asking them to do anything that's particularly tricksy or going to trip them up. We like to use topics that are easy to talk about. I think in the past, and maybe even now to some extent, we often ask students to come into our classrooms from a busy work day or from home, and we present them with a topic that they've never thought about or haven't thought about for a while, and ask them to chat about it. So we should try very hard in conversation classes to use topics that people do talk about anyway in their everyday life, rather than always trying to ask them to solve difficult problems and have views on issues which are quite difficult or sensitive. We also think that in the materials we've developed, we've tried to make sure that all the presentation vehicles or illustration vehicles and all the practice items, all the things which students use in order to practice the item, that they are supportive. And by that, they are examples of what people do actually say, and they're recognisable as the kinds of things that people say. And of course the corpus helps us enormously with this in seeing how people talk about different topics. And they should therefore be a springboard for personalisation. Perhaps there are questions that you can answer with your own information, or perhaps there are statements that with very little effort you can make true for yourself. And we should try to make room for practice as practice. We're looking at fluency here, not testing. And so those are some of the principles which we feel are important in the conversation arena.
Well, what do we do then with these principles when we have to design conversational lessons for the online environment? Jeanne referred earlier to the conversations that take place in the real classroom, and one of the perhaps more depressing pieces of research which we've read recently, and which is going to be published in a book that we'll give you the title of at the end of this webinar, is that students in the average conversational class, really each individual gets a very, very short time to speak. It could even be, 1 or 2 minutes if you're lucky out of the whole hour of a speaking lesson. And this is research done by, reported by Susan Hoinacke in the United States. So one of the benefits of the online environment is that, just as with the grammar, you can expand the opportunities for students to interact with the language that they're learning, and in this case, spoken language and conversation. So if we look, for example, of a conversation strategy, a very common conversation strategy, which is making your meaning clear, we take, as Jeanne said, fairly mundane, everyday topics that students will be feel comfortable with, and we, excuse me, I'm sorry, just going to go back, and we enable them again to do a sort of warm-up activity, and crucially the about you. So this is very similar to the grammar activity so far, with warming up the topic, warming up and personalizing it. But the next crucial phase is noticing, because students are not going to come to the grammar class and ask you next Monday, please teacher, show us how to make our meaning clearer. This is not the perception. Students think they're coming to class to learn grammar and vocabulary and maybe pronunciation. What we know from our corpus evidence is that conversation is a highly interactive activity. It's not just talking about sports or talking about your holidays. It's talking to someone, always. And so the key to fostering good conversational skills is to enable students to expand their repertoire of the interactive elements of conversation. The topics themselves are easy. What is difficult is the interactive elements. And to achieve control of these interactive elements and fluency, we need to foster noticing. Noticing is a very important notion in second language acquisition. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the literature on this by people like Richard Schmidt, who stress the importance of this noticing activity. So in the online, just as in the classroom, we have to encourage this noticing. Jeanne said earlier, we cannot automatically assume that because our learners are digital natives, that they are in fact good online learners. There's quite a lot of research that suggests that when students go online, they're pretty good at doing gap-fill grammar exercises or comprehension checks and so on, but they are not terribly good at doing the more kind of interactive activities which they would do in classroom under the guidance of a teacher. So this is all part of that training of the learner so that he or she will become a better learner, not just a better speaker of English. So the noticing activities that the learners are involved in include noticing particular key structures. In this case, we're looking at an activity, as I said, which is to do with making your meaning clear, and here are some of the key phrases that we want them to notice. I'm just saying, I don't mean, etc., etc. I'm going to move on because time is running out here. We then have a practice phase, and just as we had with grammar, we have this challenge of how we bring to the online world our principles of illustrating, practicing, conversation. So here we have a drag and drop again, which the students, where the students listen, they can play the audio, they can listen, and they can put in the appropriate expression which they hear, and these are our key expressions. But the next phase, which involves, as Jeanne mentioned earlier, new ways, doing things that are difficult to do in class and certainly would have been difficult to do in the traditional language lab, for instance. In this case, the technology enables the learner to take part in video role plays. The learner can choose which character to play in the video and listens to the video and records their own voice. So they're making a choice of a role and they're recording their own voice. Now, of course, this is a bit like pair work in the classroom. But what about all those shy students who are overwhelmed by the clever students that are around them? Well, the great thing about the online environment is it's a private environment. You can take your time. You can re-record your voice. You can do it as slow or as quickly as you like. You can change your roles. So there's a huge opportunity for new learning here. But don't forget the learner training element. Your learners may not necessarily appreciate the huge value of this kind of activity. The spoken forum is something that Jeanne mentioned earlier, where you post your answers, and as we did for the grammar, we can do this for conversation. And again, interestingly, Susan Hoynaki's research showed that students who were rather shy of speaking in class and who didn't contribute much in class actually contributed quite a lot to the online forums, even though, as Jeanne said, it's a sort of pseudo-conversation, not happening in real time. It does give the less motivated students that chance. So I know that one of the problems is just somebody's posted a question, I noticed, saying, you know, what about students who don't do the online work and they're not prepared, etc. Well, actually, there's another side to that coin, and that is that students who are not very good at interacting in class in terms of conversational involvement and engagement, you might find that in the online environment they feel more comfortable. They feel they can perform and produce. And again, this is another example of the spoken forum that we mentioned earlier on. Well, I think by now it's probably time to sum up where we think we're going with all of this. It's clear that there are challenges in moving from a classroom environment to an online environment. And what we've tried to do in this webinar is to avoid this notion that it's simply a technological change, that the technology will dictate what you do online. A lot of the early CAL teaching was done in this way when computers first came to be used for teaching in the 1990s and so on, and the computer and language learning movement, the CAL movement, had very limited technology, and it was often the technology that dictated what you could do online, basically some very mechanical activities. What we're saying here is that technology now enables you to do all sorts of exciting things, but the things you make it do should be the things which make good face-to-face classrooms, whether it be grammar or conversation. If you want to read more about what we've talked about today, and you want to read some very interesting pieces of research that have been done by other people beyond our own reports that we've given you today, very soon the Cambridge Guide to Blended Learning for Language Teaching will be published, and I'm very pleased to say that I was invited by Cambridge to be the editor of this, and it will be published by Cambridge University Press in 2016.
I think that's all we're going to say for the moment, so we would like to thank you for listening and open up to questions.
Okay,
Alistair, if you...
both very much. Yes, we've got a number of questions have come in. So let's, with no further ado, go on to answer one of those. Let's have a look at. I think you've already covered the question about where students don't do the homework, don't do the work online, and how they're likely to be more motivated to do that in this setup. But do you have any suggestions for strategies before they've got to that point where they begin to appreciate the value, when they're not doing the homework and they haven't yet realised actually quite how beneficial it is?
I think one thing that's interesting is that there will be quite a lot of peer pressure in the classroom from other students. Students who do all the preparation online when they come to class, I think, expect other people to have done it too. And I think it's a question of building students' expectations up gradually and making sure that they're with you on this journey, that they understand why they're doing this work at home and what the benefits of it are in class.
Yeah, and I would echo what Jeanne said about the peer pressure. In the traditional, conventional classroom, you work in class, and when the teacher gives the homework, well, if you don't do it, you don't do it. You say, the dog ate my homework. You make an excuse. You can't really do that with the flipped classroom, because the homework, as it were, is going to make the next class work for you, not just for everybody else. It won't work for you if you haven't done the homework, whereas very often you can skip homework and not really have any huge consequences from it. But this may involve discussion. As we said earlier, you cannot assume that the learners will know why they are being thrown into an online environment. Learner training is at the heart of it.
Okay, thanks. A question now from Diony van Eekhout, who says, I agree with the value of speaking exercises in a private environment, but how do we deal with actually improving their language if their answers are full of mistakes? Isn't that still a matter of face-to-face teaching?
No, I mean, one of the good things about the online environment is, of course, that everything is recorded. And not only is your writing recorded or your voice is recorded, in a good learning management system, your whole activity is time-stamped. The teacher can see how long you spent on an activity. The teacher can see how many times you did it, if she or he wishes. And one of the interesting things that has been reported in the research is that just because some learners were quicker online than others, it doesn't actually mean that they're any better. And it's very often students who may spend longer on an activity or doing it 2 or 3 times who may turn out to be the ones who have the better learning experience. So the online environment in some ways gives the teacher more control over what's happening. After all, if you have a big class of 35 students and you divide them into pairs or groups to have conversations with one another, there is no way that you can check on all of them as you walk around the classroom, so you don't know what mistakes they're making. But in the online environment, if you wish, you can check in any way that you desire.
And also, I think there's great value in just having that space to do speaking and the space to try out your English. And as Mike said, they'll probably be making lots of mistakes in the classroom too, and you won't be able to correct every single time they make a mistake. But is it so bad if they do? At some point in learning, it's better to be practicing your fluency without always worrying about whether you're 100% accurate, and that's what the online environment gives you.
There is something that we can add here, though, in the case of our own research and our own materials, that we do have access to the wonderful Cambridge Learner Corpus, where we can see exactly what the typical errors are which learners make all around the world at every level of the Common European Framework of Reference. And we can build into the materials error tips and error warnings, so that you're saying to the students, look, this is a typical error, we know this as a fact, so be careful. It's another kind of noticing training. Rather than you just saying, that's wrong, don't do that again, we can anticipate a lot of the errors thanks to our corpus information, and that information can be built into the materials, whether print or online. So you have a much better recourse to error correction if you have the information in advance, so to speak, from a corpus such as the Cambridge Learner Corpus.
Okay, thanks. I'm just taking us to the Principles of Good Conversation classes slide for a moment, because
somebody asked about Springboard
yes.
Personalization. Yeah, I was going to ask you if I could. I probably rushed this a little bit. What I meant by a springboard for personalization is that in any little dialogue or any question and answer or any statement that is part of an exercise, it should provide the basis for students to be able to go on and personalize for themselves. By that I mean to say something true about that topic for themselves. So, for example, if a dialogue is a question and an answer and students work with that in some way, it should then be possible for them to go on and answer that question for themselves, to give a true answer about themselves. So, how do you usually communicate with your friends? By text or by phone or whatever. You should be able to, the material should give you the opportunity to say something true for yourself. Or if you have a statement, for example, I'll often text message my friends, but I write a letter to my aunt on her birthday, kind of thing, which is a terribly invented example. But if you have a statement like that in your material, you should be able to see that you can change that slightly to make it true for yourself. So if you don't text message your friend, you say, oh, I never text message my friends. So that's what I mean by a springboard. It should be the basis for you to be able to say something true about yourself and your own views and your own experience. I hope that was clear.
Okay, thanks. We think we've got time for one more question. It's from Odetta Zabrowskiene, who says, could you explain a little more about scaffolding in grammar, please?
Yeah, well, the term scaffolding, I think, is a much maligned and misunderstood concept in language teaching. The notion originally comes from the work of sociocultural theorists such as Vygotsky, and the fundamental notion is that learning is a social activity. In other words, we learn within a social and cultural framework. It's not something that we engage in complete privacy and isolation. That all good learning is a social activity. So a social activity, of course, involves other people. And the best people to learn from are those who know more than you do, but not only because they know more than you do, the best people to learn from are those who give you the kind of help, moment by moment, adjusting to the unfolding process, the kind of help that they sense that you need. And in a way, that's the definition of a good teacher. A good teacher is someone who judges moment by moment what's happening in the classroom. This is highlighted in the work of classroom interaction analysts such as Stephen Walsh and Paul Seedhouse and Numa Markey, and something that Jane Willis, I think it was, once called spotting the golden moments. And so the scaffolding is not an artificial structure. It's not a grammar explanation in the textbook. It's not a statement of a rule. Scaffolding is a social act whereby the teacher or even another learner gives you the kind of support and help that you need at any given moment in the unfolding process of what you're trying to understand.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. But don't forget that we've got 2 webinars next week. At the usual time on Tuesday, Herbert Puchto will join us for a session on how to teach very young learners successfully. And then at 8:30 UK time, Jean Lambert will present a session on written corrective feedback. You can sign up for both those sessions by visiting our events page, cambridge.org/ELT events, as Simon has just typed into the chat. And also on Thursday next week at 3 o'clock UK time, we've got a Google Hangout with the Dictionaries and Corpus teams talking about the words of the festive season. So we'll be answering your questions. That should be a lot of fun. The recording of today's webinar should be live on our blog and YouTube channel by Friday, and we'll send you a certificate certainly by Tuesday next week. So thank you very much for everyone for attending. Thanks to my colleagues Simon and Sarah for live tweeting and moderating. And particularly, of course, thanks so much to our speakers, Jeanne McCarten and Mike McCarthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
you.
all of you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.